Redneck Survival by Cody and AI. Chapter 1. The Last Normal Day. The sound of a wrench clanking against metal echoed through the small, cluttered garage. William Henry Tucker, known to everyone as Bubba, wiped his greasy hands on an already oil-stained rag and squinted at the carburetor in front of him. He could fix just about anything with an engine. But today, he was in no hurry. The summer heat was relentless, and the air hung heavy with the scent of motor oil and sweat. Bubba tugged at his worn-out cap, the brim casting a shadow over his face as he leaned closer to his work. The radio in the corner crackled to life, cutting through the thick silence with the familiar twang of music. Bubba hummed along absent-mindedly, his mind more on the ice-cold Coke waiting in the fridge than the task at hand. The old fan in the corner did little to combat the heat, lazily turning as if it, too, was ready to call it quits for the day. Outside, the town of Rockford, Tennessee, moved at its usual pace. Kids rode their bikes down the dusty streets. The general store's screen door creaked open and shut as locals came and went, and the smell of freshly mowed grass wafted through the air. It was just another day in the sleepy little town. Bubba was tightening the last bolt when he heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. He straightened up, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand as he looked out through the open garage door. A familiar beat-up truck rolled to a stop, and Bubba couldn't help but grin as Earl, his old hunting buddy, stepped out, followed by his younger brother, Hank. "Well, if it ain't the Tucker brothers," Bubba called out, his voice thick with a southern drawl. Earl, tall and rugged with a perpetual smirk on his face, tipped his hat in greeting. "Bubba," Earl drawled, his voice carrying that signature sarcasm. "Still fixing them ancient relics? Thought you'd have moved on to real cars by now." Bubba chuckled, patting the hood of the rusty old pickup in front of him. "You know me, Earl. Ain't nothing too old for me to bring back to life. Just like this old gal here." Hank, who was lugging a crate out of the truck bed, shook his head with a grin. "I don't know, Bubba. Even you might have met your match with that one." "Nah," Bubba said, his grin widening. "I've patched her up more times than I can count. She's got a few more miles in her." Earl stepped inside the garage, his eyes scanning the familiar chaos of tools, spare parts, and random junk that filled every available surface. "How's business?" he asked, leaning against the workbench. Bubba shrugged, reaching for the cold soda he'd been thinking about all afternoon. "Same as always. Miss Ellie's sedan needed a new timing belt, and the Wilson boy brought in his dirt bike. Again. Reckon I'll be busy until supper." "Good thing you're not in a hurry," Hank chimed in, setting the crate down with a thud. "We brought you something." Bubba raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "Oh yeah? What's this?" Earl stepped aside, revealing a small, mangled bundle of wires and metal inside the crate. "Found this out by the old quarry. Figured if anyone could make sense of it, it'd be you." Bubba leaned in, inspecting the mess. "What in tarnation is this supposed to be?" "No idea," Earl said with a grin. "But if you can't fix it, at least it'll give you something to curse at for a few days." Bubba laughed, the sound hearty and genuine. "Well, you boys sure know how to keep me entertained." The trio exchanged more banter as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garage floor. The radio droned on, the singer's voice warbling through the static. It was all so normal, so routine, that none of them noticed the ominous silence that had fallen over the town outside. A silence broken only by the distant sound of a siren wailing far off in the hills. A sound that none of them, not even Earl with his sharp ears, paid much mind to. It was, after all, just another day in Rockford. Or so they thought. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm orange glow over the town, Bubba and the Tucker brothers settled into the usual rhythm of their visits. Earl perched on an old stool by the workbench, carving something out of a piece of wood with his pocket knife, while Hank rummaged through a box of spare parts, occasionally tossing one to Bubba with a questioning look. Bubba either nodded or shook his head without looking up, completely focused on the strange contraption Earl had brought him. "You know, Earl," Bubba said, squinting at the tangle of wires and gears in front of him, "this thing looks like something out of one of them sci-fi movies. I reckon it might have been part of some old mining equipment, or maybe a generator." "Or maybe it's a gizmo from Mars," Earl quipped, not missing a beat. His tone was deadpan, but the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth gave him away. Hank chuckled as he wiped the grease off his hands. "You think you'll get it working again?" Bubba shrugged, his focus still on the contraption. "I've brought worse back from the dead. Might take me a few days, though. Could be worth it if I can figure out what the heck it does." Just as he said that, the faint sound of the siren grew louder, cutting through the air and sending a shiver down Bubba's spine. He looked up, frowning. "Y'all hear that?" Earl paused his carving, tilting his head to listen. "Yeah, I hear it. That ain't the volunteer fire department, is it?" "Nope," Bubba replied, his brow furrowing. "Fire station's on the other side of town. This one sounds like it's coming from up in the hills." Hank stepped closer to the open garage door, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the distance. The siren had a strange, mournful quality to it, like a warning of something far more serious than a simple fire. "You think it's something bad?" Bubba exchanged a glance with Earl, whose usual sarcastic demeanor was replaced by a more serious expression. "Could be nothing," Earl said slowly. "But then again, it could be something." "Maybe we should check it out," Hank suggested, a hint of concern in his voice. "Make sure everyone's all right." Bubba hesitated. It wasn't like him to ignore a potential problem, but there was something about that siren that gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. "Yeah," he agreed, setting down his tools. "Let's go see what's going on." The three men piled into Earl's truck, the engine roaring to life with a throaty growl. Bubba slid into the passenger seat while Hank climbed into the back, his medical bag always close by, a habit from his days in med school. As they pulled out of the garage, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash with the last hues of twilight. They drove through the quiet streets of Rockford, passing darkened houses and empty storefronts. The town seemed unusually still, as if everyone had already gone to bed, even though it wasn't that late. The siren's wail grew louder as they approached the edge of town, heading toward the hills where Bubba and Earl often went hunting. The truck bounced along the rough dirt road, and Bubba could feel the tension in the air. Earl's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed ahead. "Something don't feel right about this," he muttered. "You're telling me," Bubba replied, glancing over at him. "I've got a bad feeling, Earl." "Yeah, well, you and me both," Earl said, his voice unusually tense. Hank leaned forward between the seats, trying to get a better view of the road ahead. "You think it's just a drill or something? Maybe the sheriff's department is running some kind of emergency test?" "Maybe," Earl replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. As they rounded a bend in the road, the source of the siren came into view. A small, weathered building perched on a hilltop, its lights flashing in the gathering darkness. It was the old county emergency center, long since abandoned, or so they'd thought. Now, it was alive with activity, figures moving in the shadows, the wail of the siren echoing off the surrounding hills. "Why the hell is that place lit up?" Bubba asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ain't nobody used that place in years." Earl slowed the truck to a crawl, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Looks like they're back in business, he muttered, more to himself than to the others. But why? Before Bubba could respond, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by another. Gunshots. They weren't far off, maybe just over the next hill. The sound made all three men tense up, instinctively ducking lower in their seats. "Those are gunshots," Hank said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to get out of here." But Earl didn't move. His eyes were locked on the figures in the distance, watching as they seemed to scramble, their movements frantic and disorganized. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low and serious. "Real wrong." Bubba's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Earl's gaze. He didn't know what was going on up there, but every instinct told him it was bad, worse than they could imagine. But before any of them could decide what to do, one of the figures broke away from the group, running straight toward them. As they drew closer, Bubba's blood ran cold. The figure wasn't running. It was stumbling, lurching, as if it could barely stay on its feet. And as it drew nearer, the flickering light from the emergency center illuminated its face, pale, bloodied, and hollow-eyed, with a gaping wound where its throat should have been. "Oh, hell," Bubba whispered, his voice trembling. "What in the world?" The figure let out a guttural, animalistic growl, its eyes locking onto the truck. Bubba had never seen anything like it, and judging by the stunned silence from Earl and Hank, neither had they. The thing was a nightmare, made flesh, something that shouldn't exist in any sane world. "Drive," Bubba choked out, fear clawing at his throat. "Earl, drive!" But Earl was frozen, his eyes wide with shock. "What? The hell? Is that?" "Drive," Bubba shouted, snapping Earl out of his stupor. Earl slammed his foot on the gas, and the truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel. The creature lunged toward them, its hands outstretched, its mouth open in a silent scream, but the truck sped past it, leaving the horror behind. Bubba's heart pounded in his ears as they tore down the dirt road, the emergency center and its nightmare inhabitants disappearing into the darkness behind them. "What the hell was that?" Hank shouted from the back seat, his voice high with panic. "I don't know," Bubba replied, his mind racing. "But we ain't sticking around to find out." Earl didn't say a word, his face grim and set as he steered the truck back toward town. Whatever they'd just seen, one thing was clear. The world they knew was gone, and something far more terrifying had taken its place. As the truck crept closer to the old emergency center, the uneasy feeling in Bubba's gut intensified. The figures moving around the building were more distinct now, but something about them wasn't right. They moved erratically, stumbling and jerking as if they were barely in control of their own bodies. Bubba leaned forward, squinting into the dim light, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Earl, you seen what I'm seeing?" Bubba asked, his voice low and tense. Earl nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, I see it, and I don't like it one bit." Hank, still peering over the front seat, finally caught sight of the figures. "What the hell are they doing?" he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The truck rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, just out of the light's reach. Earl killed the engine, and for a moment, the three men sat in silence, listening. The siren had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. Bubba could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant sound of something. No, someone, groaning. "I think we need to get out of here," Hank whispered, his voice barely audible. Bubba nodded slowly. "Yeah, reckon you're right. Ain't nothing good gonna come from sticking around here." Just as Earl reached for the ignition, a loud, inhuman scream tore through the night, freezing them all in place. It was a sound Bubba had never heard before, part animal, part human, and completely terrifying. The figures near the building suddenly snapped to attention, their heads jerking toward the truck, their eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. "Oh, hell no," Earl muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The truck roared to life, but before Earl could throw it into reverse, one of the figures broke into a sprint, heading straight for them. It was fast, faster than any human should be able to run, and its face was twisted into a grotesque mask of rage. "Go, go, go!" Bubba shouted, his heart racing as the creature closed the distance between them in seconds. Earl slammed the truck into reverse, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before finally catching and sending them hurtling backward. The creature reached out, its fingers clawing at the air just inches from the tailgate. But it was too late. The truck lurched away, leaving the horror behind in the dust. "What in the name of all that's holy was that?" Hank cried, his voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Earl barked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as he swung the truck around and floored the gas pedal. "But it ain't chasing us anymore, so I'm guessing it don't like to run for long." Bubba twisted in his seat, watching as the figures in the distance began to retreat back toward the building, their attention no longer on the truck. "They're going back," he said, more to reassure himself than the others. Earl didn't slow down, the truck bouncing and jolting as they tore down the dirt road. "We ain't out of the woods yet, boys. Whatever those things are, we gotta warn folks." "Warn 'em about what?" Hank asked, his voice edged with hysteria. "We don't even know what we just saw." "Don't matter," Bubba said, turning back to face the front. "People gotta know something ain't right. If they're smart, they'll pack up and get the hell out of here." The truck sped through the winding roads of Rockford, the town now completely dark and eerily silent. Earl glanced at Bubba, his usual sarcasm replaced by a grim determination. "Where to, Bubba? Sheriff's office?" "Yeah," Bubba agreed. "Sheriff Garrison's the only one who might be able to make sense of this." They reached the center of town in record time, the truck screeching to a halt in front of the small brick building that housed the sheriff's office. Bubba and Earl jumped out, with Hank close behind, his hands still trembling. The front door was locked, but the lights were on inside. "Sheriff!" Bubba shouted, pounding on the door. "Sheriff Garrison, you in there?" After a tense moment, the door creaked open just enough for Sheriff Garrison's weathered face to appear in the gap. His eyes were wary, and he held a shotgun in one hand, the barrel pointed at the ground but ready. "Bubba, Earl," the sheriff said, his voice a mixture of relief and suspicion. "What the hell are you boys doing here this late? You see that siren?" "We saw more than that, Sheriff," Earl said, his voice low and serious. "There's something bad going on up at the old emergency center." Sheriff Garrison's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean something bad?" Bubba leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "We ain't sure what we saw, Sheriff, but it wasn't natural. People, if you can call 'em that, moving like nothing I've ever seen, fast, strong, and angry." The sheriff's face paled slightly, but he didn't waver. "You sure about this, boys?" "As sure as I've ever been," Bubba replied. "We barely got out of there in one piece." The sheriff nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing as he weighed their words. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "All right, y'all better come in. We need to figure out what the hell's going on." Bubba and the Tucker brothers followed the sheriff inside, the heavy door swinging shut behind them with a resounding thud. The small office was dimly lit, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sheriff Garrison locked the door behind them, his shotgun now resting on his shoulder. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice grim. Bubba exchanged a glance with Earl and Hank before turning back to the sheriff. "We'll tell you what we saw, Sheriff," Bubba said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "But I gotta warn you, it ain't gonna be easy to believe." The sheriff's office felt small and claustrophobic as the men crowded inside. Bubba could hear the distant hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a low buzz that did nothing to ease the tension gnawing at his nerves. Sheriff Garrison gestured for them to sit at the small wooden table in the center of the room, but Bubba and Earl remained standing, too wound up to settle. Hank, though, sank into one of the chairs, his hand still shaking as he pulled out a flask from his jacket pocket and took a long swig. "You might want some of this," he offered, holding it out to Bubba. "Nah," Bubba replied, shaking his head. "I need a clear head right now." Earl shot Bubba a quick, sarcastic grin. "First time for everything, I reckon." Bubba snorted, but the humor was short-lived. "This ain't the time for jokes, Earl. We're in deep here." Sheriff Garrison sat down across from Hank, resting his shotgun against the edge of the table. His gaze flicked between the three men, his expression unreadable. "All right, boys. Tell me exactly what happened up there." Bubba took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to explain the unexplainable. "We were up near the old emergency center," he began, "and we saw... Well, I don't know what the hell we saw. It looked like people, but they weren't right. They were moving funny, like they were drunk or sick, but faster. And when they saw us, one of them came at the truck like a bat out of hell." "It wasn't human," Earl added, his voice hard and flat. "Whatever it wasn't normal." The sheriff frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You saying it was some kind of animal?" Bubba shook his head. "No, it was human-shaped. But it wasn't human anymore, Sheriff. It had these dead eyes, and it moved like it didn't care if its body was falling apart." Hank, finally finding his voice, chimed in. "It was like it was in a frenzy, like nothing mattered but getting to us. I've seen people in bad states before, Sheriff, but nothing like this." Sheriff Garrison was silent for a long moment, his face pale but determined. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I don't know what we're dealing with here, but it sounds like we've got some kind of serious infection on our hands." "An infection?" Earl echoed, his brow furrowing. "You think this is some kind of disease?" "Could be," the sheriff said grimly. "Rabies can make animals act crazy, and some human infections can cause delirium. But this sounds worse. If what y'all are saying is true, we might be dealing with something a lot more dangerous." "So what do we do?" Bubba asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Sheriff Garrison stood up, his jaw set. "First things first, we need to get the word out. If this is spreading, we gotta make sure people know to stay away from anyone acting strange. I'll get on the radio, try to reach the neighboring towns, see if they've seen anything like this." "What about us?" Hank asked, his hand still gripping the flask tightly. "You boys need to stay here for now," the sheriff replied. "It ain't safe to be wandering around, not with those things out there. If this infection's spreading, we need to be ready for anything." Earl bristled at the idea of staying put, his survival instincts kicking in. "And what happens when those things come here, Sheriff? You got enough firepower to keep 'em out?" Sheriff Garrison glanced at his shotgun, then back at the men in front of him. "We got enough to hold 'em off for a while, but if there's more of 'em out there, we're gonna need help. That's why I'm calling for backup." Bubba nodded, his mind racing. "We can help, Sheriff. Earl's got the survival skills, and I can rig up some defenses. Hank's got medical training. We ain't helpless." The sheriff looked at Bubba, a mixture of respect and concern in his eyes. "I know y'all can handle yourselves, but this is something different. We're not just dealing with some rabid animals or a few drunks. If what you say is true, we're facing something a lot worse." Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the office. Bubba tensed, his hand instinctively going to the wrench in his back pocket. The door creaked open, and a young deputy stepped inside, his face pale and eyes wide. "Sheriff," the deputy said, his voice shaking, "we've got a situation." Sheriff Garrison's eyes narrowed. "What is it, Danny?" The deputy swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he pointed toward the front of the building. There's something out there. A bunch of them, just standing in the street looking at the building." Bubba felt a chill run down his spine. "How many?" "I counted 6, the deputy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're just standing there, not moving. But they don't look right, Sheriff. They look dead." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Sheriff Garrison was the first to speak, his voice steady but grim. "All right, Danny, get the others and start barricading the doors. We don't know what these things are capable of, but we ain't taking any chances." The deputy nodded quickly and disappeared back down the hallway. Bubba exchanged a tense look with Earl and Hank, his mind racing with possibilities. Whatever was happening, it was far worse than any of them had imagined. "We need to figure out a plan," Earl said, his voice low and serious. "We can't just sit here waiting for them to come to us." "I agree," Bubba said, his voice firm. "Sheriff, we've got tools, supplies, and know-how. Let us help fortify this place. We don't know how long we'll be stuck here, but we gotta be ready for anything." Sheriff Garrison looked at Bubba, then at Earl and Hank, and nodded. "All right, boys, let's get to work. This might be our only chance to make sure we all make it through the night." The men sprang into action, grabbing tools, wood, and anything else they could find to reinforce the doors and windows. Bubba's heart pounded as he worked, his hands moving on autopilot. As he hammered nails into place, he couldn't shake the image of those dead-eyed figures standing in the street, waiting for their chance to strike. The night had fallen hard and fast, and with it came the creeping realization that the world they knew was gone. Whatever was out there in the darkness, it was hungry, relentless, and far more terrifying than anything they'd ever faced before. The sheriff's office was a flurry of activity as Bubba, Earl, Hank, and the deputies worked quickly to fortify the building. The sound of hammers and the scraping of metal against wood echoed through the small space, creating a harsh soundtrack to their frantic preparations. Bubba's hands moved with practiced efficiency, his mind focused on the task at hand. There was no time to dwell on the fear gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Only time to work, to survive. Earl had taken charge of the main entrance, reinforcing the heavy wooden door with metal bars and sheets of plywood. His movements were precise and controlled, a testament to his years of outdoor survival training. Hank, despite the lingering tremor in his hands, was busy gathering medical supplies and setting up a makeshift infirmary in the corner of the room. He moved with the same determination he'd shown during his years in medical school, his mind focused on the possibility that they might soon need to treat wounds, grievous ones. "Bubba," Earl called out, his voice cutting through the din. "You got any more of them nails? We're running low over here." "Yeah, I got some," Bubba replied, grabbing a handful of nails from the toolbox and tossing them over. Earl caught them without missing a beat, immediately going back to work. Hank glanced up from his supplies, his face pale but determined. "You think we're going to be able to hold them off?" Bubba paused, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Don't know, Hank, but we're going to give it our best shot." Sheriff Garrison walked over, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, surveying the work they had done. "Good job, boys. This place is looking more secure by the minute. Let's just hope it holds." "We'll make sure it does," Earl said, his voice filled with a confidence that Bubba wasn't entirely sure he shared. The sheriff nodded, then turned to Bubba. "How's that back window looking? Think you can reinforce it?" Bubba followed the sheriff to the back of the office, where a small, grimy window offered a view of the alleyway behind the building. It was a weak point for sure. If those things decided to try and break in, this would be one of the first places they'd hit. "Yeah, I can rig something up," Bubba said, assessing the situation. Give me a few minutes. He grabbed some spare wood and a metal grate from the pile of supplies they had gathered, setting to work on reinforcing the window. As he worked, his mind raced with thoughts of what was happening outside. Were there more of those things out there? Was this just the beginning of something much worse? The sounds of the night seeped in through the cracks in the walls, the distant chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and, just faintly, the low moan of something that didn't belong in this world. Bubba shivered, focusing harder on his task. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve now. "Sheriff," came a voice from the front of the office. It was Deputy Danny, who had been keeping watch out the front window. "You better come see this." Sheriff Garrison exchanged a look with Bubba before heading to the front of the office. Bubba followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a feeling whatever Danny had seen, it wasn't good. As they reached the front of the building, Danny pointed out the window. Bubba squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what the deputy was looking at. It took a moment, but then he saw it. More of those figures, standing just at the edge of the light, their forms barely visible in the shadows. "There's more of them," Danny said, his voice tight with fear. "A lot more." Sheriff Garrison's face was grim as he studied the growing crowd. They're just standing there, watching, like they're waiting for something. Bubba's mouth went dry as he counted the figures. There were at least a dozen now, and more seemed to be emerging from the darkness. They were silent, unmoving, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It was as if they were biding their time, waiting for some unseen signal to attack. "Why ain't they coming at us?" Earl asked, joining them at the window. "What are they waiting for?" "No idea," the sheriff replied, his voice low. "But I don't like it." Hank stepped up beside Bubba, his face pale as he took in the sight. "They look like they're dead, but that's impossible, right? They can't be dead." Bubba shook his head, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "I don't know what they are, Hank, but they sure as hell ain't alive." The tension in the room was palpable as they watched the figures outside. Every second felt like an eternity, the silence heavy and oppressive. Bubba could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms sweaty as he gripped the edge of the table. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to make the first move," Earl said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and fear. "We gotta do something." "What do you suggest?" Sheriff Garrison asked, his eyes still fixed on the figures outside. Earl paused, his mind racing as he considered their options. "Maybe we should try to take a few of them out before they get any closer. Thin the herd a bit, you know?" Bubba glanced at Earl, unsure. "You really think that's a good idea? We don't even know what these things are." Earl's eyes were hard as he met Bubba's gaze. "What I know is that if we don't do something, they're gonna overrun us. We can't wait for them to make the first move." Sheriff Garrison nodded slowly, considering Earl's words. "All right. Earl, you and Danny take up positions by the front door. Bubba, Hank, you two cover the windows. I'll take the back. We'll hit 'em hard and fast, see if we can't scare 'em off." Bubba's stomach churned with nerves as he took his position by the window, Hank beside him. He could see the figures more clearly now, their faces twisted and grotesque, like something out of a nightmare. They were no longer just people. They were monsters. "You ready for this?" Hank asked, his voice trembling slightly. Bubba nodded, trying to steady his breathing. "Yeah, let's do this." The sheriff's voice cut through the silence, calm and steady. "On my count, boys. 1, 2, 3. The sound of gunfire shattered the night as the men unleashed a barrage of bullets at the figures outside. The creatures jerked and spasmed as the shots hit, some of them dropping to the ground, but others barely seemed to notice. Bubba's heart raced as he watched one of the figures stagger, then slowly get back to its feet, its dead eyes locking onto the building. "They're not going down!" Hank shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Keep shooting," Earl barked, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. Bubba fired again and again, but the creatures kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. The ones that had fallen were crawling forward, their bodies twisted and broken, but still moving with an unnatural hunger. "Fall back!" Sheriff Garrison shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of gunfire. "Fall back and barricade the doors!" Bubba didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Hank by the arm, pulling him away from the window as the creatures outside began to converge on the building. They stumbled back toward the center of the room, where the sheriff and Earl were already piling furniture against the door. The sound of fists pounding against the walls echoed through the small office, the creatures outside trying to break their way in. Bubba's heart pounded in his ears as he helped reinforce the barricade, his mind racing with fear and adrenaline. "They're breaking through!" Danny shouted from across the room, his voice high with terror. Bubba turned just in time to see one of the windows shatter, a clawed hand reaching through the jagged glass. The creature's face appeared a moment later, its mouth opening in a silent scream as it pushed its way inside. "Get back!" Earl shouted, swinging his rifle like a club and smashing the creature in the face. It reeled back, its skull caving in from the force of the blow, but another one was already pushing its way through the broken window. "Fall back!" the sheriff ordered again, his voice tight with urgency. Bubba, Hank, and Earl retreated to the back of the room, where Sheriff Garrison stood with his shotgun at the ready. The creatures were inside now, their twisted forms filling the small space, their eyes glowing with a cold, unholy light. "This ain't looking good," Earl muttered, his voice grim. Bubba didn't reply, his mind racing for a solution. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "There's got to be a way out," Bubba said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. "We just got to find it." Sheriff Garrison glanced around the room, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something near the back wall. A narrow door, half hidden behind a filing cabinet. "There," he said, pointing. "That leads to the basement. We can barricade ourselves down there, buy some time." The men moved as one, pushing the cabinet aside and yanking the door open. Bubba took one last look at the creatures swarming the office before following the others down the narrow staircase, the door slamming shut behind them. As they descended into the darkness, Bubba couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far worse. Whatever these things were, they weren't just mindless monsters. They were organized, intelligent, and driven by a hunger that nothing could satisfy. And they were coming for them,